Hey guys, welcome to part 1 of Complex PTSD by Peter Walker, From Surviving to Thriving. Part 1, an overview of recovery. Chapter 1, the journey of recovering from complex PTSD. I wrote this book from the perspective of someone who has complex post-traumatic stress disorder, or complex PTSD, and who has experienced a great reduction of symptoms over the years. I also wrote it from the viewpoint of someone who has discovered many silver linings in the long, windy, bumpy road of recovering from CPTSD. I have also seen this type of recovery in a number of my friends and many long-term clients. First, the good news about CPTSD. It is a learned set of responses and a failure to complete numerous important developmental tasks. This means that it is environmentally, not genetically, caused. In other words, unlike most of the diagnoses it is confused with, it is neither inborn nor characterological. As such, it is learned. It is not inscribed in your DNA. It is a disorder caused by nurture, or rather the lack of it, not nature. This is especially good news because what is learned can be unlearned, and vice versa. What was not provided by your parents can now be provided by yourself and others. Recovering from CPTSD typically has important self-help and relational components. The relational piece can come from authors, friends, partners, teachers, therapists, therapeutic groups, or any combination of these. I like to call this reparenting by committee. I must emphasize, however, that some survivors of CPTSD engendering families were so thoroughly betrayed by their parents that it may be a long time, if ever, before they can trust another human being enough to engage in relational healing work. When this is the case, pets, books, and online therapeutic websites can provide significant relational healing. This book describes a multimodal treatment approach to CPTSD. It is orientated toward the most prevalent kind of CPTSD, the kind that comes from growing up in a severely abusive or neglectful family. In this vein, the book describes a journey of healing the damage that occurs when you suffered traumatizing abuse and abandonment. Traumatizing abuse and abandonment can occur on verbal, emotional, spiritual, and/or physical levels. Moreover, sexual abuse is especially traumatizing. I believe that we have an epidemic of traumatizing families. Current estimates point that 1 in 3 girls and 1 in 5 boys are sexually abused before they enter adulthood. And recent statistics from the Kim Foundation report that 26% of Americans over 18 have been diagnosed with mental disorders. When abuse or neglect is severe enough, any one category of it can cause the child to develop complex PTSD. This is true even in the case of emotional neglect, if both parents collude in it, as we will see in Chapter 5. When abuse and neglect is multidimensional, the severity of the complex PTSD worsens accordingly. Now, the definition of complex PTSD is more severe It's a more severe form of post-traumatic stress disorder. It is delineated from this better-known trauma syndrome by 5 of its most common and troublesome features. 1. Emotional flashbacks. 2. Toxic shame. 3. Self-abandonment. 4. A vicious inner critic. And 5. Social anxiety. Emotional flashbacks are perhaps the most noticeable and characteristic feature of complex PTSD. Survivors of traumatizing abandonment are extremely susceptible to painful emotional flashbacks, which, unlike PTSD, do not typically have visual components. Emotional flashbacks are sudden and often prolonged regressions to the overwhelming feeling states of being an abused or abandoned child. These feeling states can include overwhelming fear, shame, alienation, rage, grief, and depression. They also include unnecessary triggering of our fight or flight instincts. It is important to state here that emotional flashbacks, like most things in life, are not all or none. Flashbacks can range in intensity from subtle to horrific. They can also vary in duration, ranging from moments to weeks on end, where they devolve into what many therapists call a regression. Finally, a more clinical and extensive definition of complex PTSD can be found on page 121 of Judith Herman's seminal book, Trauma and Recovery. An example of an emotional flashback. As I write this, I recall the first emotional flashback I was ever able to identify, although I did not identify it until about 10 years after it occurred. At the time of the event, I was living with my first serious partner. The honeymoon phase of our relationship came to a screeching halt when she unexpectedly started yelling at me for something I no longer recall. What I do most vividly recall was how the yelling felt. It felt like a fierce, hot wind. I felt like I was being blown away, like my insides were being blown out, as a flame on a candle is blown out. Later, when I first heard about auras, I flashed back to this and I felt like my aura had been completely stripped from me. At the time itself, I also felt completely disorientated, unable to speak, respond, or even think. I felt terrified, shaky, and very little. Somehow I finally managed to totter to the door and get out of the house, where I eventually slowly pulled myself together. As I said earlier, it took me 10 years to figure out that this confusing and disturbing phenomena was an intense emotional flashback. Some years later, I came to understand the nature of this type of regression. I realized it was a flashback to the hundreds of times my mother, in full homicidal visage, blasted me with her rage into terror, shame, disassociation, and helplessness. Emotional flashbacks are also accompanied by intense arousal of the fight or flight instincts, along with hyperarousal of the sympathetic nervous system. The half, and by the way, sympathetic is, according to this, is feeling concern for someone. So it's a hyperarousal of the sympathetic nervous system. the half of the nervous system that controls arousal and activation, or the cause of causing activity. When fear is the dominant emotion in a flashback, the person feels extremely anxious, panicky, or even suicidal. When despair predominates, a sense of profound numbness, paralysis, and desperation to hide may occur. A sense of feeling small, young, fragile, powerless, and helpless is also commonly experienced in an emotional flashback. And all symptoms are typically overlaid with humiliating and crushing toxic shame. Toxic shame, the veneer of an emotional flashback. Toxic shame, explored enlighteningly by John Bradshaw, author of Healing the Shame That Binds. John Bradshaw in Healing the Shame That Binds. It's a really good author, and I recommend him and his books. Obliterates a complex PTSD survivor's self-esteem with an overwhelming sense that he is loathsome, ugly, stupid, or fatally flawed. Overwhelming self-disdain is typically a flashback to the way he felt when suffering the contempt and visual skewering of his traumatizing parent. Toxic shame can also be created by constant parental neglect and rejection. Early in my career, I worked with David, a handsome, intelligent man who was a professional actor. One day, David came to see me after an unsuccessful audition. Beside himself, he burst out, "I never let on to anyone, but I know that I'm really very ugly. It is so stupid that I'm trying to be an actor when I'm so painful to look at." I will never forget how shocked and disbelieving I felt at first that such a handsome person could feel ugly. But further exploration brought me understanding. David's childhood was characterized by broad spectrum abuse and neglect. He was the last and unwanted child of a large family, and his alcoholic father repeatedly attacked and looked at him with disgust. To make matters worse, his family imitated his father and frequently humiliated him with heavy doses of contempt. His older brother's favorite gripe, accompanied by a nauseated grimace, was, "I can't stand the sight of you. You make me want to vomit." Toxic shame can obliterate your self-esteem in the blink of an eye. In an emotional flashback, you can regress instantly into feeling and thinking that you are as worthless and contemplative as your family perceives you. When you are stranded in a flashback, toxic shame devolves into the intensely painful alienation of the abandonment melange or mixture. A rolling, which is something that's very upsetting, morass of shame, fear, and depression. The abandonment melange is the fear and toxic shame that surrounds and interacts with the abandonment depression. The abandonment depression itself is the dreaded feeling of helplessness and hopelessness that afflicts traumatized children. Toxic shame also inhibits us from seeking comfort and from seeking support. In a reenactment of the childhood abandonment we are flashing back to, we often isolate ourselves and helplessly surrender to an overwhelming feeling of humiliation. If you are stuck viewing yourself as worthless,
Power off.
defective, or despicable, you are probably in an emotional flashback. This is typically also true when you are lost in self-hate and virulent self-criticism. Immediate help for managing emotional flashbacks can be found at the beginning of Chapter 8, which lists 13 practical steps for resolving flashbacks, or that first video that we did for this series. We have those 13 practical steps for resolving flashbacks in that video. I highly recommend that you please do yourself a favor and write those down and have that available for you to help you calm down, because when you're in a flashback, you won't, without that sort of assistance, that sort of tool, it'll be very difficult to extricate, get yourself out of it. Numerous clients and respondents to my website. Really? There you go. Numerous clients and respondents to my website tell me that the concept of emotional flashbacks bring them a great sense of relief. They report that for the first time they are able to make sense of their troubled lives. What that tells me is something that definitely occurred with me when I started being able to label, separate into groups the things that was very confusing and very painful and very overwhelming. When I was able to actually start separating them into categories and that turned out to have these clinical labels, it was incredibly helpful, because then I could start separating them from myself and start making some sort of sense out of them. It was very liberating. They report that for the first time they were able to make some sense of their troubled lives. A common comment has been, "Now I understand why all the psychological and spiritual approaches I have pursued had so few answers for me." Because yeah, in the depths of my hell, I was reading the Bible every day and studying all sorts of academia on self-healing, but I was still in hell. Many also note feeling freed from a shaming list of misdiagnoses that have been given to them by themselves or others. This in turn has aided them in ridding themselves of the self-destructive habit of amassing evidence of their own defectiveness or craziness. When I was with my ex-husband, I had Kaiser Permanente as my insurance company. Through a year and a half of 8 different counselors and psychologists and therapists and all drug rehab and everything else, I ended up with 8 or 9 diagnoses. One of the last ones they tried to give me was bipolar. And I didn't truly feel insane until they tried to put that label on me. Because there were so many other diagnoses already on that list of who they said I was. When I was clean for 2 weeks and in rehab, well, I was in real rehab. It was 8 hours a day rehab, then go home and figure it out. Come back in the morning. If you finish this 2-week rehab, then we'll put you in a 3-month rehab, is what they told me. It's what they promised. I'd been an addict for 14 years, so 3-month rehab would have probably done me a world of good. They didn't decide to give me that after doing 2 weeks because I did so well. So I was so desperate for those 3 months of in-house rehab that it denied it to me. And I lost my mind. And I had my very first massive complex PTSD attack on the drive home from Corona to to Temecula. It was a very long 5 o'clock traffic. Hellish experience. The next day I went in and I told him about it. It was insanely. I had a nervous breakdown, is what it came down to, which meant that all my nerves went haywire and my body started doing insane things. Sweating in one moment in one spot, ice cold in another spot. It was like being in a Star Trek episode where they're beaming you somewhere and parts of your body went one place and others went to other places, and some of them came back all distorted and messed up. And I was in a car driving at the time. Thank God it was massive traffic, so most of it was still traffic, because otherwise I probably wouldn't have been able to get out of there safely. The next day when I went in and told them what happened, they said, "Oh, you have complex PTSD." And towards the end of that 2 weeks, I had to stand before my entire male fellow addict class and male instructor and read out every abuse that had happened to me. Something they would have us do as homework, and we all had to do. I read it all out. And when I looked up, some of these male friends that have been hanging out with me for almost 2 weeks then had tears in their eyes. Others couldn't look me straight in the eye. And anyway, that led to the complex PTSD attack. And because all that came out, the next day they re-diagnosed me to just having complex PTSD and a severe addiction to methamphetamine, even though it wasn't severe. It was. I know 14 years of meth addiction. I know what severe looks like. I experienced many people go through severe. I still had jobs, was still doing theater. I was still very active. But yeah, they knocked that massive diagnosis to 2 things. From 8 or 9 things to 2. So I understand this last bit of reading very well. It started to save my sanity. It became cause and effect, and I started to make sense to myself. This in turn has aided them in ridding themselves of the self-destructive habit of amassing evidence of their own defectiveness or craziness. Many also report a quantum leap in their motivation to challenge the learned habits of self-hate and self-disgust, which is exactly where I was before they switched my diagnosis. List of common complex PTSD symptoms. Survivors may not experience all of these. Varying combinations are common. Factors affecting this are your 4F type and your childhood abuse/neglect pattern. This will be the last of what we're going to read today. This list of common complex PTSD symptoms. I'm going to take them slowly. I'm going to take them one at a time. And if you have a piece of paper, I recommend that you write down the ones that resonate with you and sit with them. Be very careful with yourself. Don't nosedive into each one. Become aware of the ones that affect you. Write them down. Shut that journal or that page away for however long you need to. And recognize that the panic or fear or chaos that may come up, all the memories are supposed to come up. You're supposed to start looking at them so that you can be freed from them by and by. The list of common complex PTSD symptoms. Emotional flashbacks. Tyrannical inner and or outer critic. Toxic shame. Self-abandonment. Social anxiety. Abject feelings of loneliness and abandonment. Fragile self-esteem. Attachment disorder. Developmental arrests, also known as arrested developments. Relationship difficulties. Radical mood vacillations. Disassociation via distracting activities or mental processes. I'm going to say that one again. Disassociation via distracting activities or mental processes. For me, it was a lot of overworking, throwing myself into massive projects without any help. Hair-triggered fight/flight responses. Oversensitivity to stressful situations. And lastly, suicidal ideation. And that's where we'll stop for now. And we'll continue with suicidal ideation next time. I just want to tell you that you're not crazy. But yes, we may be very broken. During one of my healing, I don't know what you want to call it. I was part of a childhood sexual abuse survivors group. And a lady that ran it gave two examples, and I'm going to give you both and we'll close. First example was that you may have been a beautiful, delicate, exquisite china plate that got dropped and broke into, just shattered into 1,000 pieces. And you may, with a lot of effort and patience and self-love, be able to put every single one of those pieces back together. The plate will, however, forever remain broken. It'll be usable. You can see all the parts again and all its beauty, but it will be cracked. It will have cracks. It was very difficult for me to hear. And if it's difficult for you to hear, I do understand. The other example was just as bad to hear and process and recognize. It's like somebody took you and put you into pieces and put all your pieces in a big cement block And in order to retrieve yourself, you have to bust through a lot of concrete with a lot of care. Gather yourself back up. It won't be easy, but it's possible, and no one else is going to do the work for you. You have to do it for yourself. You have to be willing to have that much courage. I hope you do. That's it for now. Till next time. Namaste.